middle of the graduation party, with flashing lights, people laughing and loud music, my mother stormed in. Without a word, she walked across the dance floor, grabbed my dress tightly, and ripped the fabric in front of everyone. I froze. A hush fell over the room. Then the laughter and whispers began, like sharp blades cutting into my chest. Everyone was staring. My classmates, my teachers, even the waiters. I felt naked, even though I was still wearing my top. My mother stared at me as if I'd done something unforgivable. "You know what you did," she whispered hatefully, before leaving. I stood there, my eyes watering, my face burning. No one understood, not even me. For years I relived that scene like a nightmare. I was only 18. That night was supposed to be the pinnacle of my adolescence, but it turned into a trauma. My friends started to distance themselves. The entire school turned their backs. Even my teachers began to look at me with pity, all for a moment that seemed crazy, and that no one bothered to explain. I begged for answers, but my mother refused to talk about it. "You don't deserve to know," she'd say. And each time I persisted, she became more withdrawn. My father, always absent, as if it hadn't even happened. And so, I was swallowed by a silence that hurt more than the torn dress itself. I carried that shame for years. I moved to another city, deleted my social media accounts, and cut off contact with almost everyone from that time. It was as if I wanted to disappear, just so I wouldn't be the girl with the ripped dress. But what I didn't know was that this story had layers that only time could reveal, and that the truth, when it came, would destroy me again, only in a different way. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. Transition. That tear in her dress wasn't just a moment of rage. It was the beginning of a dark puzzle, full of secrets, lies, and buried guilt. And only many years later, as an adult, did it all begin to make sense, in the worst possible way. My name is Lindsay. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, where everyone knew everyone. My mother was a nurse, strict, a perfectionist. My father, a truck driver, spent more time on the road than at home. I was an only child, and I always felt like her unfinished project, as if she wanted me to be perfect, but I was never enough. Ever since I was little, my mother demanded more of me than any adult. Impeccable grades, exemplary posture, flawless appearance. "You're a reflection of me," she'd say. And any deviation was treated as a betrayal. I walked on eggshells. Anything could be grounds for punishment. A shorter dress, an ill-timed joke, a different look. She lived in control. I, in fear. Even so, I tried to please her. I did everything I could to get a compliment, and sometimes I did. But her smile was short-lived, as if something inside her wouldn't allow us to be happy for long. When I told her I'd been elected prom queen, she seemed happy. She helped me choose my dress, made adjustments, took pictures. It felt like a moment of connection. It just felt like it. Graduation day started out perfectly. I felt beautiful, confident, and proud. She took pictures with me on the steps of her house. She said she was proud, with a strange sparkle in her eyes. I thought she finally saw me as a woman, as someone who had made it. But now, looking back, I see that sparkle wasn't pride. It was restraint. Something inside her was already boiling. My relationship with my father was distant. He loved me, I know, but he was always absent. He called occasionally, sent cards on special occasions, and that was it. He never knew how to deal with my mother's feelings. He just hid on the streets. When everything happened that night, he didn't speak up. He disappeared for days, and I understood that in that house, silence was always the way to avoid disasters. After graduation night, my mother acted as if nothing had happened. I'd come home and she'd be in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, asking if I wanted tea, as if she hadn't ripped my dress in front of the entire school. It drove me crazy. Every silence from her was a new assault, and the worst part was that no one talked about what had happened. At school, rumors spread like wildfire. They said I'd done something unforgivable, that my own mother had to publicly humiliate me. No one knew exactly what happened, but everyone had a version. They called me promiscuous, deceitful, and ungrateful. I became a monster to the town, and the more I tried to explain, the less people wanted to listen. I locked myself away. I stopped going out, changed my hairstyle, tried to erase who I was. I started having panic attacks when walking alone. I became a shadow of myself. Sometimes my mother would look at me and say, "You know why you're like this?" But I didn't know. Or rather, I wasn't sure. And that enigma consumed me inside. One night, I summoned the courage to yell at her. "Why? Why did you do that?" She stared at me coldly and said, "You ruined everything. You didn't deserve that dress." Then she stormed out of the room, leaving me in pieces. It was like I was paying off a debt for a life I didn't even remember living. I wanted to run away from home, but I had nowhere to go. My father remained silent. When he returned from his trips, he pretended nothing was happening. It was as if the family were imploding in slow motion, and no one wanted to look at what was left. I felt alone, abandoned, as if I were guilty of something I didn't even understand. And that was what hurt the most, living through a punishment without knowing what the crime was. In the midst of all that chaos, I made a radical decision. I was leaving home the day after my 19th birthday. I spent months secretly organizing everything: documents, clothes, hidden money. I contacted a distant friend who lived in Atlanta and asked for shelter. She took me in without a second thought. The decision scared me, but staying destroyed me. The night before I left, my mother came into my room and watched me. Her eyes were red, but she said nothing. I wanted to scream, ask what was wrong with me, but I held back. We were inches apart and at the same time miles apart. She left without saying a word, as always, and that silence gave me strength. I left at dawn, before she woke up. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a fuss. I just left. On the bus, I looked out the window with tears in my eyes. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing, but it was the only way to save my sanity. It was better to be nobody somewhere else than to continue being a mistake in my own home. I arrived in Atlanta with a small suitcase and a broken heart, but there was freedom there. A strange, silent freedom that filled me with fear and also hope. I started working as a waitress at a coffee shop. At night, I studied at home, trying to dream again. For the first time, I began building a life without having to walk on broken glass. I thought I'd left it all behind, that the pain of graduation and my mother would be in the past. But old wounds don't die easily. They hide. And over time, I realized my body carried those questions like open scars. I still needed to understand what really happened that night. And one day, the answer would come, without me asking for it. The years passed, and I continued trying to move on with my life. I went to college, lived in 3 different cities, and never returned to my hometown. I cut contact with my mother. She tried to call me a few times, but I ignored her. The sound of her name on my cell phone paralyzed me. It was as if my freedom depended on the silence between us remaining intact. But nothing stays buried forever. One day, a former high school classmate found me on social media. She messaged me saying that old gossip about me had resurfaced. "Lindsay, they say you had an affair with someone at school back then. That's why your mom ripped your dress." I froze. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Was that what people thought? I was in shock. That explained the stares, the comments, the invitations that stopped coming after graduation. My mother never denied it. It never protected my reputation. She let me burn. In everyone's mind, I was the easy girl, the shame of the house. But I never did anything. I didn't even know what they were accusing me of, and that was the cruelest part of all. I decided to call my mother after almost 7 years without hearing her voice. When she answered, she was silent for several seconds. "Lindsay," she whispered, as if in disbelief. I was blunt. "Why didn't you ever stand up for me? Why did you let everyone believe I did something horrible?" She took a deep breath and simply said, "Because if I did, you would suffer so much more." That broke me. What truth was this that she was hiding so deeply? What pain could be worse than being publicly humiliated, exiled, stained by a lie? I hung up without another word, but I knew the silence couldn't last. Something very serious was buried deep inside, and for the first time, I was ready to dig until I found it. Shortly thereafter, I received a call from the hospital in my hometown. My mother had suffered a stroke. She was lucid but weakened. I faced that moment as a cruel dilemma: go see her and face everything, or continue living without the pain. In the end, my heart overcame my pride. I took the first bus and went, not for her, for myself, to close what was left unfinished. I arrived at the hospital with sweaty hands and a tight chest. I entered the room slowly. She was there, thinner, more fragile, her eyes searching for me as if she still saw me as that girl in the dress. When she saw me, she cried, and for the first time in years, I cried with her. The silence between us was broken by a single sentence from her. "You have a right to know." And then she told me everything. 10 years earlier, during graduation week, she had discovered that I wasn't my father's biological daughter, that she had become pregnant by another man during a turbulent period in her marriage. The shock consumed her, but that wasn't the worst part. She saw my dress that night and remembered the dress worn by the lover of the man she'd had the affair with. That destabilized her. She said she saw me as a repetition of her mistake, like a mirror that screamed everything she tried to bury. She didn't tear my dress for me. She tore it for herself, out of guilt, out of hatred, out of shame. I didn't know how to separate who you were from who I was, and that broke my heart in a way not even the years had been able to. I was speechless. I didn't know whether to hug her or get up and leave, but I understood. I understood that sometimes what seems like hate is just accumulated, rotten pain, exploding in the wrong way. She had hurt me deeply, but she also carried a past she'd never had the courage to face. And now, there before me, she was finally looking at it, and at me. After that conversation in the hospital, I spent days digesting everything. It was as if my entire life had been lived on a false floor. Every memory, every word, every gesture my mother made, everything took on new meaning. I wasn't the mistake. I was the living reminder of her mistake. And that, however unfair, explained everything she never said. I talked to my father, or rather, to the man who raised me. I went to the house where I grew up. He opened the door as if he'd known this day would come. We sat on the porch in silence until he said, "I always knew." My heart raced. He told me he'd discovered the betrayal when I was still a baby, but he decided to stay, to raise me, even though he couldn't look at me naturally. He confessed that he tried to love me, but that time had hardened everything. "I watched you grow and remembered what I lost." These were the most painful and human words I'd ever heard in my life. I wasn't hated. I was an open wound that never healed. And hearing that, as cruel as it was, freed me from a weight I'd carried without understanding. For years I felt flawed, as if I'd done something to deserve abandonment. But now, with the truth exposed, I saw how much I'd been a victim of a story that wasn't even mine. I'd grown up between two wounded people, trying to survive with what little I could muster of love, respect, and silence. And that, in itself, made me strong. I returned to the hospital a few days later. My mother cried when she saw me. "Can you still forgive me?" she asked, her voice weak. I didn't answer right away. I sat beside her, holding her hand. "I don't know yet, but I'm here." It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was the beginning. Because I knew, healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces, like a slow stitch. Even after everything, I still struggled with a knot inside me. How could I forgive someone who publicly destroyed me? How could I forgive someone who chose to shame me instead of protecting me? But also, how could I live the rest of my life carrying this pain in my chest? I knew that if I didn't forgive, I would be trapped by the same resentment that had destroyed my mother for years. I started writing letters, not to send, but to relieve. I wrote to my mother, my father, the man who might have been my biological father and whom I'd never met. Each letter was a piece of what was locked inside me. With each word, I understood more about who I was, and who I didn't want to be. I didn't want to become anyone's mirror. I also sought therapy, something I'd always avoided, as if facing my past would mean reliving it. But I discovered that facing it isn't reliving, it's transforming. And there, in front of a stranger who listened attentively, I was able, for the first time, to say out loud, I deserved love. And it was as if I'd shouted it to 18-year-old Lindsay at her prom. Over time, my anger gave way to empathy, not out of pity, but out of understanding. My mother lived trapped in her own mistake, and when she looked at me, she saw the reflection of everything she'd tried to hide. She lashed out at me because she couldn't deal with her own guilt. It was wrong. It was cruel, but it was human. And that didn't justify it. It explained it. An explanation sometimes is the beginning of healing. I returned to the hospital once more. My mother was better. I sat beside her, held her hand again, and this time firmly, I said, "I forgive you." She wept silently, and so did I. There, in that cold room, 2 generations of pain met, and for a moment, there was peace, not complete, but enough for a real new beginning. With the forgiveness spoken aloud came an unexpected feeling, courage. For the first time, I felt strong enough to face head-on what I'd avoided for years. I returned to the school where it all happened. It was different, of course, but the hallways still held ghosts. Each step there was like opening a locked door in my memory, and I was ready to face them all. I met the principal, who still remembered me. She was surprised by my visit. I told her I'd come back to close a circle. She apologized. She said she never fully understood what happened that night. The city was too quick to judge, she admitted, and hearing that, after so long, was like a belated gesture of justice. It still hurt, but it was healing. After school, I walked to the graduation party venue. The hall still stood. It was old and worn, but there, in front of that building, I decided to make a symbolic gesture. I took a piece of satin from my pocket, the fabric of the dress I'd kept for years. I buried it there, in the ground, with my hands. It was my way of saying, this no longer defines me. In that moment, I felt a freedom, unlike the one I'd experienced when I left home. It wasn't escape, it was closure. Burying that piece of dress didn't erase what had happened, but it showed me that I would no longer be held hostage by that trauma, that I could look back without drowning, and that the place of pain was now different, smaller, lighter, almost bearable. Before leaving, I sat on the bench in the square in front of the school. I saw teenagers leaving with backpacks, laughing, living their own dramas. I saw myself there, years ago, full of dreams and fear, and I whispered to myself, you survived. Not just others, but everything they made you believe you were. And for that reason alone, I felt invincible. Returning to Atlanta was like breathing new air. But now, I wasn't the same. I carried answers, healed wounds, and a new sense of who I was. I started writing my story on a blog. At first, it was just for me. But little by little, I noticed that other people were reading, relating, and commenting. It was as if my pain, now shared, took on new meaning. Each text was a piece of me exposed, but also healed. I spoke of shame, humiliation, the torn dress, silence. I spoke of forgiveness, therapy, my mother. And as I wrote, I realized my story was not unique. Many also carried hidden truths, silent traumas, and a desperate desire to be seen. I was no longer alone. I was invited to speak at a school about overcoming obstacles. I returned to my hometown and entered a room full of teenagers. I looked at each one as if they were looking at me. Years before, I told them everything. No embellishments, no pretense. And when I finished, a girl came up to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "You gave me courage." That's when I understood my purpose. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through in the dark. If my voice can light someone's path, it's all worth it. Not because the pain becomes less, but because it's no longer in vain. I started writing a book, a bigger, deeper project, a whole cry, transformed into pages, a tribute to the girl no one defended, not even herself. Today, I look in the mirror and see something new, a whole woman, full of flaws, yes, but master of her own story. The torn dress doesn't define me. My mother's silence doesn't define me. My father's abandonment doesn't define me. What defines me is the courage to carry on, to transform broken pieces into bridges, to refuse to be a victim when I can be the author of my life. Months later, my mother called me. Her voice was weak, slurred, as if time was finally taking its toll on the past. She said she wanted to see me, that there was more to say. Part of me hesitated. Forgiveness had already been given, but could I handle more revelations? Still, I went. Because now, I was going by choice, not necessity. I arrived at the house where I grew up. The same door, the same worn carpet, the same smell of antique wood, but everything seemed smaller. My mother stood in the living room, a blanket draped over her legs, looking like a smaller version of herself. She smiled when she saw me, and this time, the smile was real, weightless, without expectation, just human. She told me about the biological father I never knew. She said he tried to contact me when I was little, but she wouldn't let him. I was afraid he loved you more than I could. Those words hit me like rocks. She didn't push me away out of protection. She pushed me away out of insecurity, out of fear of being replaced in the heart of a daughter she herself had pushed away. And then she handed me a box. Inside were letters, many, all from the same man, some with photos, others with sweet words, talking about me, asking how I was. My mother never replied, but she kept everything, for years. It tore me apart. One father rejected me for not being his, and the other never had the chance to love me. I cried there, beside her, with the box in my lap, as if holding a piece of my childhood that had been stolen from me. My mother cried too. There was no more screaming, no more blame being thrown around, just two women trying to make peace with the wreckage that remained. And in that moment, I felt something I never thought I would feel there. Peace. She held my hand and said, "Thank you for not being like me." And that was perhaps the biggest apology she could muster. I smiled slightly, because I knew, indeed I wasn't. I had chosen to break the cycle. And nothing, not the ripped dress, not the silences, not the lost years, would change that. Shortly thereafter, she passed away, quietly, at home, without a hospital, without visible pain. I was with her. I held her hand until the very last second, and even with all the baggage we carried, she left in peace, not because everything was resolved, but because in the end, there was truth, and the truth, however painful, has the power to soothe even the most battered hearts. The funeral was intimate. A few friends, some old neighbors, my former childhood classmates. No one mentioned the dress. No one talked about graduation. Only I knew the weight that coffin carried, not just of a life, but of secrets. And as I watched it descend, I felt I was burying with it everything that no longer belonged to me. Old pain, inherited guilt, past silences. After the funeral, I went to the lake where we used to walk on Sundays when I was a child. I sat by the water, with the box of letters beside me, and began reading them one by one. Each word was a conversation that never happened. Each sentence was a chance unused. And yet, I felt loved there, by someone who tried, even from afar. I understood that I was desired, I was sought after, and that healed something that not even my mother's presence could touch. For years, I thought my worth was measured by the love I was denied. But there in the letters, I understood that love is also an attempt, that sometimes it fails, interrupted, but it still exists, and that was enough for me. I returned home with a new silence in my heart, not the silence that hurts, but the silence that comforts, the silence that says, "You've made it this far." Today's Lindsay isn't perfect, but she's whole, because she had the courage to look where it hurt, to say what needed to be said, to listen even to what hurt, and above all, to not repeat what once hurt her. That night, I lit a candle, not out of mourning, but out of gratitude, for the chance to have survived my own story, for the chance to have ended the cycle with dignity, for the woman I had become, and for the girl who, finally, can rest in peace within me. After all this, I realized that something had changed in me forever. I was no longer driven by pain or anger. I was driven by purpose. I began to build a new version of myself, made of conscious choices, not reactions to the past. For the first time, life felt like mine, in my hands, under my will. It wasn't easy, but it was real. I began therapy more intensely. I dove into myself like someone seeking solid ground after years adrift. I uncovered traumas that weren't mine, but that I'd carried for so long. And I also realized how strong I was for moving forward when the easiest thing would have been to give in. Pain taught me not to conform to what was destroying me, to not accept less than I deserved. I went back to studying, writing, and building. I enrolled in a psychology program. I wanted to better understand the mind, what drives someone to hurt so much without realizing it. But I also wanted to help others find their voice. There was no longer room for shame within me. I was the girl with the torn dress. Yes, but now I was also the woman who sewed herself back together. I got involved in social projects, mainly with young people experiencing emotional neglect. In each face, I saw versions of myself, teenagers who just wanted to be seen, loved, understood. The pain that once silenced me now fueled my healing. What was once my greatest source of shame became my greatest tool for connection and empathy. I started giving talks. I told my story at schools, events, and discussion groups. Every time someone said, "I thought I was the only one who felt this way," my heart warmed. Was that why everything had happened? Maybe. Maybe life was preparing me to be a bridge, not to forget, but to transform, not to pretend nothing hurt, but to show that it's possible to move on even so. And in this process, I reconnected with myself, with the girl who loved to dance, read, and write, with the woman who loves intensely, who feels everything deeply, who no longer runs away from the mirror. I embraced myself, literally. I looked in the mirror and said, "I forgive you," because deep down, I blamed myself too, and I finally freed myself from carrying the mistakes of others as if they were my own. With a lighter heart, I made room for new things, new relationships, new experiences, new affections. I met someone who listened to me with genuine attention, who wasn't scared by my past, nor tried to erase it. For the first time, I felt loved in a healthy, whole way, without needing to prove my worth, without needing to hide scars. In the first few months, I was still scared of affection. Sometimes I'd back away for no reason. He'd ask me, "Is everything okay?" And I'd say yes, but I was learning to receive it, learning that love isn't a threat, that affection isn't an obligation, that a hug can be a shelter, not a trap. And this process was, for me, more transformative than any diploma or applause. With him, I began to think about building a family, one where love wasn't conditional, where silence wasn't a weapon, where truth was the foundation. I wanted to be for someone what no one was for me, but now, with balance, with awareness, without carrying open wounds into a new story. And that made me grow even more. We decided to adopt a child. We wanted to give love to someone who had also been left behind. The choice was emotional, yes, but also rational. We knew we had much to offer, and that healing together was possible. When I met that girl with shy eyes and a restrained smile, I knew this was her. She was the chance to do everything differently, to rewrite the ending with love. Our first day home was silent, but full of meaning. She looked at me fearfully. I smiled and said, "Here, no one tears their dress. Here, we sew everything back together." She smiled, not fully understanding. But there, in that shy smile, I saw the seed of what I'd always wanted: belonging, truth, love that endures. And so began a new cycle. A cycle without shouting, without accusations, without fear. A cycle of building, of listening, of presence. A cycle where the past no longer rules, where pain becomes a bridge, where the wounded Lindsay gave way to a woman who finally knows exactly who she is, and who now chooses love consciously, and no longer as compensation. Today, when I look back, I see a road full of fragments, but also full of bridges I built myself. The girl with the torn dress hasn't disappeared. She lives inside me, but now she dances. She smiles. She recognizes herself, and most importantly, she was heard. Finally, after years of silence and closed doors, I listen to myself. I carry my scars with pride, because they tell a story almost no one has seen. A story of overcoming, of deep pain, of daily courage. I wasn't perfect, but I was whole, and that's what defines me. Not the screams, not the dress, not the lost years, but the choice to get up, even when the ground seemed definitive. That graduation night no longer haunts me. It became a milestone, a before and after. It pushed me into a pain that, unintentionally, forced me to discover my strength. And that's what I want you to understand. Sometimes, the cruelest moment of your life is also the one that will lead you to your true self, even if it takes years to understand that. If you've also been silenced, diminished, hurt by those who should love you, I see you. Your pain is real, but your story doesn't have to end there. You can write another ending, one where you choose yourself, one where you embrace yourself, one where you free yourself from the lies you've been told about who you are, and most importantly, the ones you've come to believe. Today, my mission is this: to be a voice where there was silence, to be love where there was abandonment, to be a presence where there was absence. And if my story touched you in any way, then the entire journey thus far has been worth it, because every tear transforms when it becomes a bridge for someone else to cross their own darkness. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and comment here where you're listening from. I read everything with an open heart, and every comment shows me that telling stories like this matters. Thank you for being here, and never forget, you deserve love, always.